Are you someone who wants to try sim racing with VR but is worried about motion sickness? Perhaps you've tried VR and it instantly made you feel sick. Well, that was me 6 years ago. I could barely last 15 minutes without feeling terrible. But in that 15 minutes, I was completely hooked. So for months I set about trying to find every single solution I could find, and I finally did it. I can now drive symptom free for hours on end, and you can too. So how did I do it? Well, I've got 10 tips in this video for you to help you overcome motion sickness, and I use quite a few of these myself. So let's get into it. So tip number one of the first things I would recommend if you're suffering from motion sickness is to ensure your system maintains a consistent 90 FPS in the VR headset. Smooth, high frame rates reduce visual lag and discrepancies between what you see and feel, and all that means it minimises sensory conflicts that can trigger motion sickness. This was the first thing I focused on when I started because I saw occasional lags in the game and it would just make me feel so sick. Now, if you can't achieve a consistent 90 FPS, what we're going to have to do is, at least while you're still suffering, is to reduce the graphic settings down until you can hit that consistent frames a second. And I get it, the image might not look as good as it did, but trust me, a consistent frame rate is essential to getting you used to a smooth visual experience rather than choppy, laggy images. To monitor this in Steam VR, there's a built-in performance monitor graph you can enable within the headset to keep an eye on this, and there's also one in the Oculus debug tool as well. Tip number two is to point a fan at your face while racing, but the primary reason that the fan will help you is it provides that constant physical sensation that anchors you to the real world. The airflow from the fan gives your body a consistent physical cue that helps you bridge the sensory gap between, again, what your eyes see and what your body feels. Also, VR headsets can get very warm, and this can cause you to feel warm too. And a fan helps keep you cool, which can also reduce discomfort and nausea associated with overheating. Tip number three is begin with slower cars and those with more enclosed cockpits. Slower cars naturally produce less rapid visual motion in the headset, and this reduction of visual changes is easier for the brain to process. The slower pace allows the user's brain to adapt more gradually to the VR experience. Enclosed cars like GT cars have a more restricted moving view compared to open wheelers or convertibles. You can't see anything around you moving essentially, you can only see what's moving through the windscreen. And it's this limited field of view that reduces the amount of visual information that's moving within the VR headset. Elements like the dashboard and the A-pillars remain fixed in the user's field of view, and these stationary elements help anchor that visual experience, which again provides a stable point of reference that can reduce that sensation of motion. If you've ever seen the helmet camera that's inside an F1 driver's helmet, this is designed to show us what the driver would see. But when we watch this on television, we see a lot of movement, but this isn't what the driver is seeing. The human visual system naturally stabilizes our view of the world, which keeps the horizon level even when our head tilts or moves. And this brings us on to tip number 4. In sim racing, the lock to horizon setting is designed to replicate this natural visual stabilization, and this makes the VR experience feel more natural and reduces sensory conflict. So tip number 4 for people suffering with motion sickness is to enable this option to replicate what you would see in the real world. By stabilizing the view, this setting allows drivers to focus more on the track and less on the movement of the cockpit, which can be distracting and potentially nauseating in VR. Tip number 5 is ginger. Ginger has natural proven anti-nausea properties, and by keeping the digestive function stable, it helps maintain consistent blood pressure and reduces the likelihood of nausea triggered by motion sickness. Now, it comes in various forms, in biscuits, capsules, juice, tea, and it's also pretty cheap. And studies have shown that consuming it before an activity can reduce the symptoms of motion sickness. Now, I'm not a fan of ginger, but I do know people who have used this to combat motion sickness, and they've reported it works very well for them, so give it a try. Tip number 6 is, if you can afford it, and I can't, incorporate a motion platform that moves in sync with the virtual environment. So When you turn a corner in the sim, the platform tilts to simulate the G-forces that you would feel in a real car. A motion system reduces this mismatch between what you're seeing and what you're feeling by providing corresponding physical sensations, making the experience more coherent for your brain and less confusing. Am I telling you that you need a motion platform to overcome motion sickness? No, not at all. I don't have one, and I use other tips here to overcome motion sickness. Although it is next on my upgrade list, so if anyone does want to send me one to review, I would be very happy to help. Tip number 7 is acupressure bands. So like C-bands, these apply pressure to a point on the inner wrist. Now, this point is traditionally used in Chinese medicine to alleviate nausea and vomiting, and studies have shown that wearing acupressure bands can decrease abnormal gastric activity associated with motion sickness, and this helps to stabilize the stomach and reduce nausea. So you simply wear these whilst you drive. They apply, as I said, a continuous pressure without the need for doing anything else, and it allows you to focus on your sim racing experience. Now, I've not used these myself, but again, I do know people that have, and they've reported that they've worked very well to help reduce motion sickness. They're pretty cheap too, so why not give it a try? Tip number 8 is to start with short sim racing sessions, around 5 to 10 minutes. I made it. Gradually increase this, but don't carry on for longer periods just because you feel fine. So by starting with shorter sessions and progressively increasing them, your brain has time to recalibrate its expectations and responses to the virtual environment. Also, big tip, start in practice mode or test day mode with you being the only car that's on track. Don't start with a race and a full grid of fast moving objects in front of you. Remember, we're trying to limit the amount of visuals moving rapidly in the VR headset until you can get used to it. So start with just you on the track, and as you begin to be able to drive for longer without any symptoms, then maybe try it with a small grid. Tip number 9 is to ensure your VR headset is properly fitted and isn't loose. A well-adjusted headset provides the clearest, most comfortable view. It reduces eye strain and potential discomfort. And it means that the VR headset stays in place during sim racing when you're having to look over your shoulder to see if that person's just tried to make a dart up the inside of you. Also, measure your interpupillary distance, IPD, and make sure this is correctly set on the headset. Now, IPD is the distance between your pupils, and a correct adjustment just ensures that each eye is focusing on the center of its respective lens. To get the best results, take time to adjust the headset straps for a snug but a comfortable fit. Measure your own IPD by checking out the links in the description below, and use any IPD adjustment features your headset offers, whether that's physical or software based. If your headset has a numerical IPD setting, measure your actual IPD for the most accurate setup. And finally, remember to recheck the fitment of your VR headset and the settings periodically because they can shift during use. And number 10, begin with tracks that have fewer elevation changes. This might seem like a no-brainer, but the smoother the surface and fewer the turns will mean that the visual motion perceived is more gradual and predictable. Now, Silverstone is a good track for this. It is pretty flat, being an old airfield that was used in World War II. It has a couple of elevation changes, but the national version of the track is even shorter. Also, try to avoid tearing around the track as fast as you can, at least until you get used to using a VR headset for a while. You'll want to avoid suddenly crashing head-on into a wall from 200 miles an hour. This sudden halt of motion in the headset can cause motion sickness. And you'll also want to avoid spins too. Again, this quick change in direction can, you guessed it, cause motion sickness. And one that caught me out by complete surprise is avoid going backwards. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second you jump in the sim and just drive backwards, but when I first put the car in reverse after hitting a wall at 200 miles an hour, and it caught me out completely, made me feel instantly sick. And what you're aiming for is smooth movement within the headset at first. And once you're ready, absolutely you can then take on the Nordschleife. But again, we have to build up to this. And finally, my most important tip, which is probably tip 11, is don't give up. I know this is easy to say, but it will take some time. Remember, individual responses to VR can vary, so it is really important to experiment with these different tips and find what works best for you. Always listen to your body and take breaks if you start feeling uncomfortable.